So if you haven't noticed this week, winter's arrived. It's finally started raining, which is a good thing. Some people are really happy it started raining. Some people are already complaining that it's too wet and when will the rain stop. But of course, this week, it's not real rain, is it? No. I mean, if you lived in Sydney or the south coast of New South Wales, what we had isn't real rain. If you've ever been to Northern Territory or Asia or somewhere tropical, the rain that we had this week isn't real rain, is it? I've spent, as I often say here, I've spent a lot of time in Thailand, and when it rains in Thailand, it really rains, it can be 35 or 40 degrees during the day, baking sunshine, and usually early afternoon, the big black clouds roll in and it starts to rain. And it rains like you're standing under a hose. It's unbelievable. And of course, when I'm there, what happens is when it rains like that, all the stupid white Australians run out into the rain, right? Because we don't ever see rain like this, and everyone gets really excited and runs out in the rain. And standing under cover are all of our Thai friends and family looking at us like, what is wrong with you people? It's wet out there, it's dry out here, why would you run out into the rain? Because they see this rain all the time. For them, that kind of monsoonal, tropical rain, that's just what they call rain. So it's no deal to them, but it was a big deal to us because we don't see rain like that. Something that's a once-in-a-lifetime event for us is just an everyday thing for them. There's lots of things in life that are like that, aren't they? Things that are abundant or everywhere, and so they become kind of no deal to us. But when they become scarce or rare, we hold on to them tight and we value them in a different way. Do you remember the first time you ever went to an all-you-can-eat place? You can always tell the first timers at an all-you-can-eat place because they rush the buffet and they fill their plate like a mountain. But of course, when you've been there a few times, you know that you don't need to do that because the food just keeps coming. And when the plate's empty, it just gets refilled and you can walk up there casually and take a small amount because you can go back and back and back and back. And, if you're like me, until you're sort of rolling up there and rolling back because you know that there's more where that came from. Right? You don't have to rush it and grab it and hold it so tightly because you know that the food just keeps coming at a place like that. When things are scarce or rare, we treasure them, we hold them tightly. But when things are abundant, we become more free and more generous with those things. There's a moment in Jesus' life where he points out abundance and generosity in a way that blew the minds of his disciples. And it became a really important story for those people who followed Jesus. But it's a story that we hardly ever tell today. We're going to jump into that story today. It's a story, and I want to be honest about this. This is a story that could change your life forever. And I say that because this story changed the life of the first people who heard it forever. So get ready, grab your Bibles, and we're going to start in Mark chapter 12. If you need a Bible, there's always free Bibles at the back of the room. Mark chapter 12, 2/3 of the way through a paper Bible if you've got one. Of the boys' names, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Mark's the second one of those. If you've got a Bible on your device, just scroll through until you see the name. Mark chapter 12. And we're right near toward the end of Mark chapter 12. We're going to start reading in verse 41. Mark chapter 12, verse 41. Let me read it to you. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put, and he watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts. But a poor widow came, and she put in 2 small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all that she had to live on." The temple that Jesus is talking about in Jerusalem was a huge place, like size of football field or bigger than that. In the middle of the temple was the actual temple, the temple building. But no one could go into the temple building. Only priests could go into the temple, and even then only under certain conditions. So most people who came never went inside what they called the temple. They met on the temple courts that were outside, which was like a huge plaza area with covered colonnades around the edge of it. And people would come and they would meet in the temple courts. And they would worship together. There'd be small groups of people all over the temple court area, and they would be worshiping together, they would be praying together, they would be listening to teaching. Rabbis would set themselves up in a corner and people would come to them and listen to their teacher. They would sit there and they would discuss spiritual things. And one of the things that they would do in that area is they would give. There was literally a big box, like a big chest with a hole cut in the top of it that sat in the temple court area, and people would come and they would make their offerings there. And this story happens one day when Jesus is sitting around in the temple courts with his disciples and his followers, talking about spiritual things, praying, whatever's happening for them. And wherever they're sitting, they can see the temple treasury. They can see the box. And Jesus is watching people who come up to the box, and he's watching wealthy people come up and, empty large sacks of stuff of coin and gold and silver and such into the box. And then he notices a poor woman come up and put in 2 small copper coins. The Greek word for those coins is a lepta. It was the smallest Roman coin there was. So I guess for us it's like a 5-cent piece, right? And she comes and she puts 2 of those coins. It would be like someone in this church donating 10 cents. That's it. And Jesus calls his disciples, or he gathers their attention. He says, hey, look over there. And then Jesus drops this bomb. He says, truly I tell you, this poor woman, that woman that you're looking at there, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty gave everything, put in everything, all she had to live on. Now that's exactly the opposite of what the disciples expected he would have said. It's the opposite of what I expected he would have said, right? I mean, you would expect Jesus to say, wow, look at all the money that rich person put in. Imagine all the good that can be done with such a large amount of money. Think of all the poor people that could help. Think of all the good work that could do. But Jesus doesn't talk about the rich person's offering at all. Makes no comment, just lets it happen, lets it pass by. Not a bad thing, but lets it pass by. He calls their attention to the offering of this poor widow. And I'm not great at maths, but if she put in 10 cents, if someone puts in, $10, they've put in whatever it is, 100 times more than she has. If someone's put in $100, they've put in 1,000 times more than she has. I mean, what could you do with 10 cents? I mean, you think, in today's, like, what can you do with the poor? What can you do to help the poor with 10 cents? What can you do to support people in a church like this with just 10 cents? But Jesus said she gave more. Because they gave out of their wealth. Some translations will say they gave out of their surplus, their extra, their above and beyond. She gave out of her poverty. She gave all that she had. In other words, they gave above their comfort line. You know that comfort line? We all have that line. It's different for all of us, but we all have that line in our lives, and the money and the stuff that we have below that line, that's the untouchable, because that's the stuff that we really need. And then above that is the excess stuff that we, play with or do things with, and that's the stuff that we can give away, the stuff that's above the line, but you can't touch the stuff that's below the line. That's the stuff that you really need. And Jesus points to this woman and says, she's not doing what everyone else is doing. She's not giving from above the line, from the surplus, the extra. She's giving from below the line. She's giving all that she has. They gave out of their excess. She gave all she had to live on. And with those words, Jesus redefines generosity forever in the lives of the people who heard that. Jesus is saying to them that generosity is not about the amount that you give. It's about what that amount means to you. He's recognising that $10 can be nothing for someone, and that same $10 can mean everything for someone else. Some people can give $1,000 and it barely moves the needle. Their bank account would barely notice it. For other people, they can't imagine ever having $1,000 in a bank account. You might not realise this, but generosity is at the heart of what it means to be Christian. Generosity has always been at the heart of what it means to be Christian, because generosity is at the heart of the God that is the foundation of the Christian faith. I don't know what you think about when you think about God. When you say the word God, everyone has certain sort of thoughts or words that come to their mind. Some people think about words like kind, big, angry, loving, whatever you think about. But I want to suggest to you this morning, whatever you think about when you hear the word God, one of the words that you should always think about is the word generous. From the very beginning pages of the Bible, the picture of God that the writers of the Bible want us to get is the picture of a generous, abundant God. If you start reading the Bible from the beginning, you begin with the creation story in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. And that story is all about showing us a creative and loving and generous and abundant God. It's a picture, it's a story, a picture of God creating all kinds of plants, trees full of fruit, waters that are, it says in Genesis, teeming with living creatures, overflowing with living creatures, birds in the sky. Genesis 1:22, this is the very first chapter in the Bible. God blessed them and he said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the waters of the sea, let the birds multiply on the earth. Then God creates people and he says the same thing to the first people. God blessed them. This is Genesis 1:28-29. God blessed them and he said, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the air and every creature that crawls on the earth. Then God said, behold, which is Bible language, so pay attention, listen to this bit. I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the face of all the earth and every tree whose fruit contains seed, they will be yours for food. Can you hear the language of abundance and generosity in that? Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. I give you everything. They will be yours. And you have to remember that the people that are first reading this don't have online shopping and supermarkets. Right? When they're hearing language about being given the fish and the birds and the trees and the plants, they're not thinking about the environment as in a place to go on Saturday and have a walk and take a photo. This is their food and the stuff that's sustaining them. Do you understand that? We think about those things as sort of part of our part-time, part of our fun to go outside and say, look at the birds. This is the stuff that they caught and ate and fed their families on. This is a picture of an abundant God who's providing for his people everything that they need to live on and to enjoy full and lasting and abundant life. And understanding that picture of God, understanding that picture of a generous God is what gives people the ability to be generous back to God and to be generous to others around them. Imagine I have some lollies. Right? How generous will I be with these lollies? Well, the answer is it depends how many lollies I've got, right? There's just 4 lollies in this bowl, right? There's 3 now. How generous would I be with these lollies? Well, not so generous because there's not a lot of them, right? I'm pretty likely to keep these to myself because there's only 3. But if I had like a kilo of these things, how much more generous am I likely to be? A lot more generous. Even though I'm not because I'm a more generous person, but if I understand that I'm stuck on my lolly now.
Should have been more generous.
Yeah. But do you see the picture? When I understand that there is an abundance of these things, when I'm not thinking about, well, I can count them 1, 2, 3, but when I'm thinking there is an abundance of these things, it gives me, it's just natural for me to be far more generous because there's so many. There's more here than I could possibly eat, though I'd be willing to give it a crack. Because I know there's more here than I can possibly, and this is just a kilo. Imagine if there were 10 kilos or 20 kilos or 100 kilos, I'd start handing them out to anyone I knew because I would know I'd never eat that many. That's how life is, that's how we're supposed to see life with God, right? We're supposed to see such a huge abundance that sharing and giving away and generous is just natural because this is a never-ending stream. This is like Thai rain or, a smorgasbord. You never get through it. You can never eat through a smorgasbord, right? The faster you eat, the more the food comes. That's how we're supposed to see life with God. That's how we're supposed to see the God of generosity and how it's supposed to impact our life. When Jesus is pointing at this woman, when he's saying that she gave more in God's eyes than the rich person because she was willing to give away everything she had, Jesus isn't just making a comment about the woman. He's saying something about who God is. Can you see that? Jesus is saying, here's someone who understands the generous, abundant nature of God. Here's someone who understands that God has given her everything and that there is more where that came from, and she can give away, in this case, all that she had because God is a big God and He will sustain her. That's why she could be so generous. When you understand who God is, when you understand how generous and extravagant God has been to you, how much He loves you, how much He's given to you, when you understand all of that, then generosity becomes just a natural response. When you've got a kilo of lollies, you don't need to think about, well, should I share them or not? You're like, I can't eat them all. We'll just share them. Our generosity shows, that the generosity of people shows how much we trust God. It shows that we trust that God has our future in His hands. It shows that we trust that God is a God of provision. He's a good God who loves us and has our future in His hands. We can be generous. We can give not just out of our surplus, not just the extra stuff, but we can even give what is below the line. We can even give the stuff that we think of as necessary because we trust that God is good and God is generous and He will provide for us. That's what Jesus is teaching the disciples when He points to the woman giving all that she has to God. And I don't think the disciples ever forgot that moment. In fact, I think that moment impacted them deeply. And I say that because when you fast forward 10, 20, 30 years and you track the lives of the men and women who were surrounding Jesus right at that time, 30 years later, Paul writes a letter to the church in Corinth. This is 2 Corinthians 8. Write it down and look it up later. Paul says this, 2 Corinthians 8. We want you to know, writing to the Corinthian church in Corinth, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability. Paul's writing to one church, to one group of people, about another church, another group of people. And he says that their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. Where have we heard those two words connected together before? Poverty and generosity. They gave as much as they were able, even beyond their ability. Where have we heard that idea before? 30 years after the resurrection, there are whole communities of people who are living like the woman that Jesus pointed to. That moment of Jesus pointing to them and saying, this is who God is, this is how we live in response to that, became so big for them, so transformational for them, that it became the way that they lived for decades after that. This kind of radical generosity, crazy generosity, became a part of the way that these first churches lived. Out of their poverty came overflowing joy and extreme generosity. This kind of generosity has nothing to do with how much money you have in the bank. It comes from trusting that God is generous and abundant. It comes from trusting that God will supply all that you need. When people trust God, when people believe that God is generous and abundant, then they're free to give abundantly and generously themselves, right? When they understand that this is a never-ending supply, they become extraordinarily generous. They start giving lollies to everyone they see because there's always more where this came from. They don't just have to give out of their surplus. They don't just have to give sort of the extra what's off the top, above the line. They can give away everything. They can give away below the line because they believe that God is abundant and generous and that He will keep providing. It's like turning on a tap. You know, the more water you give away, the more water comes out. This kind of generosity became a core part of the early church. It became one of the distinctives about the early church, actually. Because they, like us, lived in a world where other people didn't do that. Where other people were holding tight. Where other people were keeping for themselves. Where other people were fighting over resources. And here was this crazy group of people who are giving freely and generously of their resources. It was one of the key things that set them apart. If you're a Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus today and you're thinking, you know, how do I get people to notice my faith? Generosity is one of the very best ways that you can get people to notice that there's something different about you. We're talking about an attitude and a mindset of generosity. And I just want to say, this is not just about money, and this is certainly not about giving money to the church. This is about being generous with our time. Having time to help someone out. I don't just mean your kids and your best friends and your family, but being willing to give time to others generously. Living in the moment, not rushing and not stressing about time. This is about losing the word busy and about being fully present with the people that you're with. You know what that's like. You know those people who just when you're with them, you feel like they've got all the time for you in the world. It's about being generous with our time. It's about being generous with our attention. It's about listening to people, about really listening to people. Not just listening to them so that then when there's a break you can tell your story, but asking them follow-up questions. Dare I say it, putting our phones away and giving people 100% of our attention. And of course it's about being generous with our resources and our money and our stuff. Lending things to people even if you think it might not come back. Not just waiting for someone to ask for something, but offering things to people. In fact, sometimes giving things to people before they've even asked. Whatever you were doing yesterday, Megan was out shopping for everything for the breakfast this morning. When some of us were still in our pyjamas, Matt was here at 8 o'clock this morning cooking a breakfast. Tom and Ree spent some time last week baking biscuits for us all that we enjoyed here. Steve and Bev have done the same. Every week there's people here at 9 o'clock in the morning setting up the chairs and cleaning the toilets and getting the tea and coffee ready. But it's not just about what happens here on a Sunday, is it? Every Monday night, when most of us are cooking our tea, there's a small group of people from this community who are at the local bakery loading up their cars, getting crumbs all in the boot of their cars, loading up their cars with bread and driving around to the homes of local people in need and handing them out free bread. Every Monday, there's a team of people who do that. Steve and Bev aren't here, so I can embarrass them. Last week, they got on a bus, went into town and spent the day walking up and down the streets of town handing out blankets to homeless people that Bev had handmade. There are kids right now, and I'll get emotional, there are kids right now in poor countries who are getting free education and healthcare because there are people in this church who sponsor a child, who every month see a small amount of money leave their bank account so that some poor kid in another country that they're never going to meet can go to school tomorrow. I bet there's lots of other stories. The point is, none of that matters. The amount of money, the amount of time, the amount of things doesn't matter. It's all about an attitude of the heart. Can you see that? Yeah. My point is, this is what generosity looks like. It's these everyday decisions to put others before yourself, to trust that God is abundant and generous. And that, you know what, if I give away my time, if I give away my energy, if I give away my money in the service of the gospel, that God will back that up and He is generous and abundant and that things will work out. And of course the point Jesus is making, it's not about the cookies and it's not about the barbecue and it's not about the church and it's not about the sponsor kids in a sense, it's about our hearts. When it comes to generosity, our attitude matters more than the amount. In fact, the whole point of Jesus pointing to this woman is saying when you get the attitude right, the amount just follows. Paul says in that same letter to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, he says, each of you should give what you've decided to give in your heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. He's saying don't give because anyone's pressuring you. Don't give because you feel like you have to. Don't treat this like some kind of tax, where the government come and say, you've got to give this amount of money. Generosity and giving's not that. Don't give because there's any sense of stress. Paul says if you're going to give like that, it's actually better if you don't give at all. The attitude matters more than the amount. God isn't excited because someone gives $20 or $200 or $2,000 or $20,000, and there's some people who can give $20,000. God's excited when you trust Him enough to give generously at all. God's excited when you trust Him enough to give everything, whatever your everything is. Now, let's be honest for a moment. I know that talking about this stuff makes some people feel uncomfortable. Some people have been brought up to think that giving and generosity is a private matter and it's just, it's your personal business and no one should be talking about it at all. Some people think talking about generosity in any way feels like pressure. Some people are uncomfortable about this because as soon as we link this, we're talking about trusting God, it feels awkward to link trusting God to our generosity because it feels like we're measuring people's trust in God, right? And some of us just straight up feel worried because as soon as we start to even think about this kind of generosity, we start to think, well, what if I don't have enough left over? What if I do this and then I can't afford this? What if I do this and then I don't have enough time for this? What if I focus my attention on this, then I won't have enough attention for that? And I want to say, if you feel like that, I get it. Because I'm being honest, like I feel like that too. You know, I run my own business full time and it's still young and, you know, I don't draw a proper wage. I've got a wife and 3 kids and, you know, my life's full on and busy, and then feel like God with a couple others says, go start a church, and, you know, where have I got the time and the money for that? And, you know, I get all of that. If I do all this, will I have enough time and money? You know, will there be enough left for me? I understand how uncomfortable Jesus' words and the implications of those words for us can be. And to be honest, that's why I said in the beginning, we don't read this story very much. A lot of people like to skip stories like this, you know. We like to think this is a story for other people. This is a story for those wealthy people. I hope they read that and do something about it, you know. This is a story for people with more free time. You know, well, I'm really busy. My job's, you know, my family, I can't do that. But for other people, this is a really good thing for them to be, you know, thinking about the way they use their time. Generosity, that's for adults, or, you know, I'm just a kid. You know, it's not for me. But at the end of the day, as we keep saying, generosity isn't a question of how much I give. It's not a question of how much you have. It's a question of how much I trust God. It's a question of how much you trust God with what you've got now and with the future that's ahead of you. Do I trust that God is a generous and abundant God? Do I trust that He has provided me? Do I believe that He has provided me everything? And do I trust that He will provide everything for me going forward? Do I trust Him enough to live a generous life now? Do I trust Him enough with my future to live a generous, like a below the line generous life now? Not just giving out of my surplus, but giving my everything. Remember, this is a God that has held nothing back from you. This is a God that created the world. Everything. That's the intention of the creation story in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, is to let you know that there's nothing here that doesn't have God's fingerprints on it. And of course, fast forward from the Genesis story, and we have John reminding us in that famous verse, if you only know one verse in the Bible, you know this one, for God so loved the world that He gave. He gave His only Son, the thing that was most precious to Him. He gave that to us as well. That's how generous and abundant is the picture of God that the Bible writers, you know, when they put this together, that's what they want you to get. And we're talking about this because we want to be that kind of church. Right? We want to be a collection, a community of people that live that kind of generous life. As I say, we've got a pretty clear destination for us as a church. It's written up here every week. We want to be people who are devoted to Jesus, living our lives following Jesus' example and teaching wherever we are, no matter the cost. That means we're not here because we're good. We're all a bit of a mess, let's be honest. We're not here because we're special. I mean, we're special in the sense that God made us special, but we're not more special than people who aren't here, if you know what I'm saying. We're not here because we're generous. No, we're not here because we're good and special and generous. We're here because God is good and special and generous. Do you get that? And so in that sense, this church is an invitation to us. Is an invitation to us by God. This church is an invitation for you to come and to learn more about God and who He is, to learn more about how much He loves you, To sit in the reality that He loved you enough to die for you, that He rose from the dead so that you could have new life, abundant life now and forever with Him. It's an invitation that you can therefore live a life that gives back to God just a fraction of all that He's given to you. That's the invitation of this church that God, I believe, is making to all of us through this community. Giving generously of our time to serve others, giving generously of our energy and our attention to really be with others, giving generously of our money and our resources. That's the kind of people that we want to be, because that's the kind of God that we believe in, yeah? And you're invited to be part of that journey.